A single, sharp knock shattered the stillness of the night. It wasn't the kind of faint tapping you might hear from the wind or a tree branch brushing against the house. It was deliberate, firm, insistent, the kind of sound that echoes in the silence and pulls you violently from the safety of sleep. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it or if it was a fragment of some forgotten dream. Then came another knock, louder this time, followed by two more in rapid succession. My body froze as a jolt of adrenaline coursed through me, leaving my pulse hammering in my ears. 3 a.m. The glowing numbers on my bedside clock felt like an accusation. I sat up slowly, straining to listen beyond the quiet hum of the heater. There was again 3 more knocks, each more insistent than the last. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. My first thought was that I must be imagining it. No one comes knocking at this hour unless it's important or dangerous. The silence that followed felt alive, pressing against my skin, amplifying every tiny creak of the house settling. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a neighbor in trouble? A prank? Or something worse? I glanced toward the window, the thin curtains barely concealing the inky blackness outside. There was no movement, no sound beyond the rhythmic drumming of my own heart. The air in the room felt heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. As the last echo of the knocks faded, a suffocating stillness settled over the house. My heart was racing, its frantic beat filling the void left by the silence. I could feel it, deep in my chest, a gnawing sense that something was off, something beyond the mere oddity of a visitor at this hour. I sat there for a moment, the blanket still wrapped around me, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. A prank, maybe, kids being stupid, or a mistake, a lost delivery driver, confused by the late-night fog. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the unease wouldn't leave. It clung to me like a second skin, cold and clammy. It wasn't just the knocks. It was the timing, the way the sound had reverberated through the house, cutting through my subconscious like a knife. Whoever was at the door wasn't just passing by. They wanted something. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hesitating before meeting the cold floor. The air felt colder than usual, like the heating had given up sometime in the night. My room, usually a sanctuary, felt foreign now, alien in its silence and shadows. I thought about turning on a light, but quickly dismissed the idea. Light felt too revealing, too loud. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake just yet. The minutes stretched on, or maybe it was only seconds. I couldn't tell anymore. Every sound was amplified in the darkness. The soft rustle of the curtains in the faint draft, the faint creak as I shifted my weight on the bed. Even my own breathing seemed to echo too loudly in my ears. Who would be knocking at 3 a.m.? My mind offered scenarios, each one worse than the last. A neighbor in danger, a random intruder, or someone with darker intentions. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and moved toward the door of my bedroom. The hallway beyond was a black void, unwelcoming and silent. I hesitated at the threshold, my instincts warring with my curiosity. My gut screamed to stay where I was, to lock the door and wait it out. But my feet moved on their own, pulled forward by a mix of dread and a need for answers. The silence after the knocks was somehow worse than the sound itself. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, a void that pressed against my ears. My thoughts spiraled as I reached the doorway, my hand brushing against the cool wood of the doorframe for support. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness ahead. Every nerve in my body screamed that something wasn't right. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from taking that first step into the hallway. The hallway stretched before me, a black void that seemed to swallow the faint moonlight, slipping through the edges of the curtains. My breath caught as I stepped forward, the cold floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Each sound felt deafening, as though the darkness itself was amplifying it. mocking my attempt to move quietly. The air here was different. Heavier, colder, as though the hallway had been untouched by the warmth of the house. The shadows clung to the walls, unmoving, as if waiting for me to draw closer. I hesitated, letting my eyes adjust, but the darkness remained impenetrable. I reached out instinctively, my fingers grazing the wall for the familiar switch. The idea of light seemed comforting for a split second before I stopped myself. Whoever, or whatever, was outside didn't need to know I was coming. My pulse pounded louder in my ears as I drew my hand back. Step by step, I moved forward. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was alive, humming with possibilities. My senses were on high alert, every creak of the floorboards beneath me sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, the weight of the darkness behind me pressing down harder with each passing second. Nothing but the faint outline of my bedroom door greeted me. Still, it felt as though something unseen was standing there, watching me retreat further into the unknown. As I reached the midpoint of the hallway, the air seemed colder still. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself as if to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The faintest draft of air brushed past me, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth, though I couldn't imagine where it was coming from. I tried to focus on my breathing, deep, steady inhales to calm my racing heart. It didn't help. My mind was alive with imagined scenarios, someone hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to get close enough to pounce, the figure from the door slipping inside unnoticed, now lurking somewhere nearby. The door to the living room loomed ahead, its outline barely visible against the oppressive blackness. Beyond it lay the front door, and whatever waited on the other side. I stopped in front of the living room door, my hand hovering near the handle. For a moment, I thought about retreating, locking myself back in my bedroom and pretending none of this was happening. But the sound of those knocks played over again in my head, insistent and deliberate. Whoever was out there hadn't left, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't until I faced them. I stood at the threshold of the living room, staring at the front door across the darkness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, a steady rhythm that seemed to grow louder as the silence dragged on. I couldn't tell if the oppressive quiet was suffocating me or sharpening my senses, but every second felt stretched, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I took a cautious step forward, the soft creak of the floor beneath me sounding unnaturally loud. My eyes flicked to every corner of the living room, scanning the shadows for movement, half expecting something to leap out at me. Nothing moved. The room felt static, like a snapshot, but the tension was almost unbearable. The door loomed ahead, a barrier between me and the unknown. My instinct was to retreat, to bolt back to the safety of my room and ignore this entirely. Yet, something deeper, some gnawing curiosity or sense of obligation, pushed me forward. I reached the door and paused, my breath shallow and uneven. My hand hovered inches from the cold wood, and for a moment, I thought I could feel the faint vibration of life on the other side, as though the tension between me and whoever was out there was tangible. Placing my ear gently against the door, I listened, though it felt cool and smooth under my skin, but the other side offered no clues. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence. The absence of sound was almost more alarming than if I had heard something. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus, willing my breathing to steady. My head swam with questions. Was it a stranger? Someone I knew? Were they in danger, or was I? And then, as if sensing my hesitation, it happened again. 3 knocks. I flinched, stumbling back a step. These weren't timid or accidental. They were deliberate, measured. Whoever was on the other side wasn't going away. My chest tightened as a fresh wave of anxiety gripped me. I couldn't tell if the sound was closer this time, or if my heightened senses were playing tricks on me. For a moment, I stared at the door, paralyzed. I could feel my thoughts spiraling, imagining every possible scenario. What if this was some kind of trap? What if I opened the door and whatever was out there wasn't human? The thought sent a chill down my spine. But then came a second realization. What if it was someone who needed help? A neighbor, a lost traveler, someone desperate? Could I live with myself if I ignored them? I leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes and trying to push the dread out of my mind. The knocks hadn't come again yet, but I knew they would. Whoever was out there wasn't done. This wasn't over. My trembling hand hovered over the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to look. I wasn't sure I could handle what I might see, but I knew I had to. The silence that followed the last set of knocks was heavier now, almost expectant. Summoning what little courage I had, I leaned forward, pressing my eye to the small lens. At first, the distorted view of the dimly lit hallway outside offered nothing but empty space. But then I saw him. A man stood just beyond the door, his face partially illuminated by the weak yellow glow of the corridor's light. He wasn't facing me. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, his movements stiff and uneasy, as though he expected someone or something to appear behind him at any moment. He was tall, though the peephole made his features seem slightly warped. His dark coat looked soaked, clinging to his frame, though it hadn't rained that night. His hair was messy, his jaw tight, and his eyes, even through the distorted glass, I could see the tension in them, wide and darting as if scanning for danger. For a moment, I considered retreating, letting him knock again until he gave up and left. But there was something in the way he moved, the nervous shifting of his weight, the way he glanced back over his shoulder again and again. It didn't look like someone who meant harm. It looked like someone who was afraid. He stepped closer to the door, his hand reaching up as if to knock again but stopping halfway. His shoulders slumped, and he leaned forward slightly, resting one hand against the doorframe. Through the peephole, I could see his lips moving, muttering something I couldn't hear. My chest tightened. He didn't look dangerous, but I couldn't shake the unease coiling in my gut. What was he running from? And why had he chosen my door? I stayed frozen, my eyes still pressed to the peephole, trying to make sense of the situation. Then, as if sensing my presence, he turned his head toward the door. His face came fully into view for the first time. His expression wasn't one of anger or malice. It was desperation. His mouth moved again, forming words I couldn't hear, but his eyes told me enough. He was pleading. I stepped back, my mind spinning. Opening the door felt like the worst possible idea. But leaving him out there, could I really just ignore someone who looked so genuinely terrified? I glanced back toward the dark hallway behind me, half expecting to see shadows shifting or something creeping closer. The idea of letting a stranger in at this hour made my skin crawl, but the thought of him being left alone out there felt worse. Another knock shattered my hesitation, softer this time, but no less urgent. I inhaled deeply, my hand brushing the cold metal of the lock. What should I do? My hand lingered on the lock, trembling as I wrestled with the storm of thoughts in my head. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to walk away, to pretend none of this was happening. But those eyes, the way they had pleaded through the peephole, were burned into my mind. I couldn't ignore him. I took a shaky breath, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the lock. The sound of it turning echoed louder than I'd expected, breaking the heavy silence in the room. With every click of the mechanism, my heart pounded harder. The moment stretched, frozen in time, as I grasped the handle. My knuckles were white as I gripped it, my pulse racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. Slowly, painfully, I pulled the door open just a crack. The air from the hallway was colder than I had imagined, slipping inside and wrapping around me like icy tendrils. The man stood just inches away now, his face coming into clearer focus under the weak corridor light. His eyes widened slightly as the door moved, relief flickering briefly across his features before it was replaced with something sharper: fear. I stopped, leaving the door only partially open, the security chain still latched. "What do you want?" My voice was steadier than I felt, but just barely. He took a step back, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "Please," he said, his voice low and trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I need help. Someone's after me." The words hit like a hammer, and I struggled to process them. Someone was after him? My eyes flicked to the hallway behind him, half expecting a shadowy figure to step into view. But there was nothing, just a dim light and empty silence. "I don't know where else to go," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Please, I just need to call someone. That's it. I promise." My grip tightened on the edge of the door. Every part of me wanted to slam it shut and lock it again, to put the barrier back between us. But the way he looked at me, his desperation, his shaking hands, it felt too real, too human. "Why here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why my door?" His eyes darted toward the stairs at the end of the hall before snapping back to me. "I don't know. Your light was off." It felt safer. "Please, just let me call someone. I'll go. I swear." The way he said it, so urgent, so full of dread, sent a chill through me. He didn't just want help, he needed it. But could I trust him? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the open crack of the door between us. His words hung in the air unanswered. My mind spun with questions, but deep down, I already knew my choice. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Then, with hands that felt heavier than they should, I unlatched the chain. The sound was deafening in the silence. I opened the door fully, the cold air hitting me like a slap, and took a step back to let him in. The man stepped inside hesitantly, as if even now he wasn't sure if he'd made the right choice. I stayed near the door, gripping it tightly, as though ready to slam it shut again if something didn't feel right. The air between us was thick with tension, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway beyond. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice hoarse and uneven. The words felt genuine, but there was something else in his tone, a tremor of fear that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I studied him as he stepped further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. Up close, he looked even worse than I'd expected. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and the damp coat clinging to his frame only added to his disheveled appearance. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, someone who had been running from something for far too long. "Who's after you?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence between us. His head snapped toward me, his expression a mix of panic and uncertainty. "I don't know exactly," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "But they've been following me, watching me. I don't have much time." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. He wasn't lying. I could see it in the way his hands trembled, in the way his gaze kept flicking toward the windows as if he expected something to burst through them at any moment. "I just need to make a call," he continued, his voice cracking. "Please, I can't stay long. I just need to call someone who can help." I hesitated, my mind warring with itself. On one hand, his desperation was palpable, almost contagious. But on the other, a small voice in the back of my mind kept asking, what if this is a trap? What if the danger isn't out there, but in here, standing in front of me? Still, I nodded, gesturing toward the kitchen table where my phone Saturday. "You can use that," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "But you stay right there. No funny business." He nodded quickly, his relief obvious as he moved toward the table. His hands were shaking as he picked up the phone, fumbling with the screen for a moment before dialing a number. I watched him closely, my body tense, ready to react if anything seemed off. The room felt colder now, as though his fear had seeped into the walls. "Come on, pick up," he muttered, pacing slightly as the line rang. "Come on." Finally, someone must have answered because his posture shifted. "It's me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Yeah, I need help. They're close, I think. I don't know how much longer." His voice trailed off, and he glanced at me, his expression torn. Whatever he was saying on the other end of the line, I could only catch snippets. Pleas for help, hurried instructions. When he finally hung up, he turned to me, clutching the phone tightly. "Thank you," he said again, his voice steadier now but no less urgent. "I have to go. They'll know I stopped here if I stay too long." His words left a hollow feeling in my chest. Whoever he was running from, he wasn't safe yet. But as he handed me the phone back, all I could do was nod. As he handed me the phone, my fingers brushed against his, and I could feel the coldness of his skin, a sharp, almost unnatural chill that lingered even after he pulled away. He looked at me with an urgency that made my stomach twist, but he said nothing more. I shut the door behind him, the lock clicking into place with a finality that should have brought relief. Instead, it only deepened the unease settling over me. The room was silent again, but my mind was anything but. Should I have let him in at all? I paced the small living room, replaying everything that had just happened. His story seemed genuine. His terror had been real enough to make me believe him. But who was he? Why had he been chosen to be pursued, and by whom? A sharp pang of doubt struck me. What if he wasn't the victim? What if I had just helped someone dangerous? Someone who had lied their way inside my home and used my kindness as a shield. I stopped pacing, leaning heavily against the back of the couch. My breaths came shallow and uneven, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing. He had been desperate, terrified. No one would fake that level of panic. Would they? But then, there was the other question gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. If someone was truly after him, had I just painted a target on my own door? I turned toward the window, the thin curtain barely concealing the outside world. The dark night seemed impenetrable, the streetlights casting long shadows that danced with every shift of the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that eyes I couldn't see were already fixed on me. A sudden noise, distant but distinct, snapped me out of my spiral. It sounded like footsteps, faint and hurried, retreating down the corridor outside. My heart leapt into my throat as I approached the door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps faded, and the silence returned, heavier now, almost suffocating. Had it been him? Was he running away? Or was it someone else? I couldn't stand still any longer. My mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. I moved to the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the block, the cold steel offering a hollow sense of security. I didn't know what or who I was preparing for, but I couldn't stand the idea of being unprepared. My phone was still in my hand, and I debated calling someone, anyone, but what would I even say? That a stranger had come to my door claiming to be followed, that I'd let him in, helped him, and now couldn't shake the feeling I'd made a mistake? I shook my head, clutching the knife tighter. The fear that had crept into my home wasn't going to leave with a phone call. And yet, a part of me still wondered if I had done enough. What if he was truly in danger? What if, by sending him back out there, I had condemned him to something I couldn't even imagine? I sat down at the edge of the couch, the silence pressing in around me like a physical weight. The knife was still in my lap, my phone in my hand. My mind wouldn't quiet. Had I just saved someone, or had I made the biggest mistake of my life? The minutes dragged on like hours. I stayed seated on the edge of the couch, gripping the knife in one hand and my phone in the other, unable to settle the storm of thoughts raging in my mind. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every distant sound outside twisted my nerves tighter. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over, that his presence, his story, had left something unfinished, lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. I stared at the door, the barrier that separated me from whatever world he'd brought to my doorstep. It didn't feel like enough. Rising slowly, I crossed the room, careful to make as little noise as possible, and double-checked the lock. My hand lingered on the deadbolt before I reached up to slide the chain into place again. The soft scrape of metal brought a fleeting sense of control, but it wasn't enough to quiet my nerves. I moved to the window next, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. The street was eerily empty, the weak glow of the streetlights casting long, unmoving shadows. There was no sign of him or anyone else. For a moment, I thought I caught movement near the end of the block, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. My thoughts circled back to his words, his desperate plea. Someone's after me. I didn't know what that meant, but I couldn't stop imagining the worst. Was he running from a person? A group? Something less explainable? I tightened my grip on the knife and stepped away from the window, unwilling to stay so exposed for too long. The room felt too quiet again, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me. What if he wasn't safe yet? What if he hadn't gotten away? The thought hit me like a gut punch. He'd been so desperate, so sure he didn't have time. If someone had been following him, they could be close, too close. I paced the room, my footsteps soft against the floor. My phone buzzed in my hand, the unexpected vibration jolting me out of my spiral. The screen lit up with a message notification, just an automated alert from a weather app, but the sudden noise made my heart race. I stared at the phone, debating whether to call someone. The police? A friend? But what would I say? That a man I didn't know had come to my door claiming to be in danger, and now I was afraid I'd gotten myself caught up in something I didn't understand? I placed the phone on the counter and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The knife felt heavy in my hand now, but I wasn't ready to put it down. Not yet. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I couldn't relax. My instincts were screaming at me to stay alert, to be ready. Whatever had started tonight wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. The night stretched endlessly, thick with a silence that refused to let me rest. I sat on the edge of the couch, the knife still clutched in my hand, its weight a small comfort against the unease gnawing at me. My eyes kept darting to the door, to the windows, to every shadow that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I wanted to believe it was over, that he'd left, and whatever danger he'd brought with him was gone. But deep down, I knew better. There was a heaviness in the air, a lingering tension that refused to dissipate, like the room itself was holding its breath. Every sound became suspect. The distant groan of the house settling, the faint whisper of wind against the window pane, even the soft hum of the refrigerator. My ears strained for something out of place, something that didn't belong, but the quiet was maddeningly persistent. I found myself replaying the night's events over and over in my head, searching for answers in the chaos. His face, pale and desperate, lingered in my mind. The fear in his eyes had been real. I was certain of that. But everything else about him was a mystery. Who was he? What had he done to find himself hunted? And who or what had been after him? I stood abruptly, the sudden movement jolting me out of my thoughts. The knife trembled in my hand, and I set it down on the kitchen counter, my fingers stiff from holding it so tightly. My phone sat next to it, the screen dark and silent. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? I had no name, no details, nothing concrete to offer. A man had knocked on my door, claimed he was in danger, and left after making a call. It sounded absurd, even to me, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that by letting him in, I'd become part of something larger, something I didn't understand. I moved to the window again, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer outside. The street was empty, still bathed in the cold glow of the streetlights. But then, something caught my eye, a faint shadow near the corner, shifting just beyond the range of the light. My breath hitched, and I leaned closer, straining to make out the figure. It moved quickly, slipping into the shadows of the next building, too far away for me to see clearly. Was it him, or someone else? A chill ran through me as I let the curtain fall back into place. The unease I'd been trying to suppress surged to the surface, wrapping itself around me like a vice. I locked the door again, triple-checking the chain, and stepped back. My pulse was hammering in my ears, my skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. As I sat down, the weight of the night pressed down on me, heavier than ever. I didn't know who the man was or what had happened to him after he left. But one thing was certain. The fear he'd brought to my doorstep wasn't leaving anytime soon. The room felt colder, the silence louder, and the shadows deeper. The questions I'd been asking all night remained unanswered, and I wasn't sure they ever would be. All I could do was sit and wait, hoping the knock on my door would never come again.